His heart pounding, Antonio rose from his bed, the haunting images from his dream refusing to fade. He moved around his apartment restlessly, picking up random items and setting them back down, trying to occupy his mind with something other than the faces of his victims. But it was no use. He was on edge, the guilt gnawing at him from the inside. He pulled on a jacket, grabbing his keys off the hook by the door. The streets of Okoro were quiet, the city seemingly asleep. Yet Antonio was wide awake, his mind plagued with restlessness. The night air was cool against his skin as he made his way to his car. His destination was the abandoned Mercedes house in Garden City. It was a place that held chilling memories, the place where his monstrous acts had unfolded. But it was the only place he knew would offer some kind of solace. It was his dark sanctuary. He drove through the silent streets, the city's usual hustle and bustle replaced by a haunting tranquility. The occasional street lamp cast long shadows that danced around him, matching his somber mood. As he neared Garden City, the grand, vacant houses loomed ominously in the night. He parked his car a few blocks away from the Mercedes house, choosing to walk the rest of the way. The silence of the night was broken only by his footsteps echoing against the cobblestone streets. The Mercedes house stood imposing and forgotten, its once grand facade now weathered and weary. Antonio made his way through the overgrown garden and into the house. The smell of damp and decay welcomed him, as if the house were acknowledging its sole visitor. He descended into the basement, the darkness enveloping him, just as the whispers of the watchers often did in his head. He felt the chill of the concrete floor seeping through his shoes, just as it did in his dream. This basement was more than just his personal domain of terror. It was a gateway to another dimension, a sacrificial altar to the watchers. Antonio stood, reveling in the coolness of the space that mirrored the abyss between dimensions. His eyes moved from one shadowed corner to another. Each dark enclave bearing the weight of tormented souls offered to those who observed from beyond. Antonio knew he was their chosen one, their earthly instrument, appointed to bring them the gifts they craved. The room's simplicity was deceptive. At a glance, it contained just a lone table, stained with the memories of those who had suffered upon it. 4 had been sacrificed here, their screams echoing into the vast void where the watchers resided. Each offering, each life taken, was a step closer to his ultimate goal, to bridge the gap between his world and theirs. Antonio's thoughts drifted back to his first victim in this basement, Rosa Diaz. Rosa was a socialite, a woman who cared about her appearance, and believed in the power of magic to maintain her beauty. The moment she entered his store, asking for books on magic, spells, and rituals to preserve her beauty, he felt a rage inside him that was inexplicable. He didn't like the entitlement in her voice, the vanity in her eyes. His rage bubbled under the surface, a violent storm waiting to break free. Antonio began stalking her, observing her routines, her habits, her obsessions. One evening, Rosa came into his store, furious that the spells and rituals from the books weren't working. Seeing an opportunity, Antonio offered to help her. He told her he was proficient in magic, that he had performed successful spells and rituals before. He couldn't believe how gullible Rosa was when she agreed to accompany him to the house where he performed his rituals. In the dimly lit room of the Mercedes house, Rosa looked around nervously, a glint of anticipation in her eyes. Antonio had tied her to the table, convincing her that it was part of the ritual. Rosa had looked at him, her eyes filled with fear and confusion, but she didn't protest. Antonio remembered the coldness of the knife as he held it in his hand, the sharp edge glinting in the dim light. He made the first incision on her cheek, telling Rosa that the blood of the face was necessary for the ritual to work. The gasp of pain that escaped her lips sent a thrill through him. Rosa's eyes, filled with pain and betrayal, bore into his, as he raised the knife once more and plunged it into her heart. Rosa's scream was cut short as her life force seeped out of her and onto the cold, hard table. As her life drained away, Antonio branded her corpse with the symbol of the Camino de Santiago, the scallop shell, his silent calling card. The satisfaction Antonio felt in that moment was intoxicating. The pleasure that Antonio derived from Rosa's death did not last as long as he would have liked. The thrill, the power, the exhilaration all faded, leaving a void that hungered to be filled. Soon he found himself yearning for that thrill again. And it was during this period that he met Maria. Maria was a young university student, an ambitious spirit, with a thirst for knowledge that matched Antonio's thirst for power. She lived with her parents, her life revolving around her studies and her passion for art history. She walked into his store one day, looking for literature on the art history of the Castilian kingdom during the reign of Alfonso X. Maria was working on a story about the famous king and his influence on the arts in Spain. She didn't believe in relying on the internet for her research. Instead, she preferred original sources, hard copies of books and ancient scrolls. Antonio saw an opportunity in Maria's dedication and obsession. She was so engrossed in her research that she barely noticed anything else. It was easy to get her to trust him. He offered to show her his collection of ancient texts, claiming to have a special interest in Alfonso X himself. He was all too willing to assist Maria in her quest for knowledge. He guided her through the shelves, presenting her with ancient texts that sparked her interest. But when he led her to the secret room of the bookstore, filled with books on magic and the occult, Maria didn't show the same enthusiasm as Rosa. She was solely focused on her research, uninterested in the supernatural world that Antonio had immersed himself in. Despite this small setback, Antonio was not deterred. He could still sense Maria's vulnerability, her naivete. It was simply a matter of time before he made his move. And so, he bided his time, waiting for the perfect opportunity. The opportunity presented itself one evening when Maria was on her way home from the university. He had been following her for a few days, familiarizing himself with her routine. With a well-planned excuse of a new shipment of ancient texts that had just arrived at the Mercedes house, he was able to persuade Maria into his car. Once they arrived at the Mercedes house, he managed to get her into the basement, under the guise of revealing a rare collection of art history books. Maria's last art history lesson. The excitement in her eyes dimmed, replaced with fear and confusion as Antonio began his terrifying ritual, repeating the horrific acts that had claimed Rosa's life. Despite the fear and resistance from Maria, Antonio felt an unholy satisfaction. The screams, the tears, the pleading, they all served to fuel the perverse thrill. And once again, as the life drained out of Maria's eyes, he felt the fleeting fulfillment he craved. Only this time, it vanished even more quickly, leaving behind an even bigger void that demanded to be filled. Unlike Rosa and Maria, Theresa Lopez was fighting a battle of her own even before she crossed paths with Antonio. She came into the bookstore with a determined look on her face, a result of her ongoing battle with terminal cancer. She was looking for any remedy, no matter how far-fetched, that could offer her a glimmer of hope. The desperation in Theresa's eyes matched his own thirst for satisfaction. He guided her to a book on dark magic that promised miracles. When Theresa's eyes lit up at the sight of the book, he felt a surge of anticipation. Once Theresa purchased the book and left the store, Antonio started stalking her. He learned her routine, the medical appointments, the visits to the health food store, the quiet evenings she spent at home with her daughter, Mariana. After a few weeks of observing her, he finally found the perfect opportunity to intercept. One rainy day, he approached her as a stranger needing a lift. Theresa, kind-hearted as she was, agreed without hesitation. That was the last time she was seen alive. In the cold, damp basement of the Mercedes house, Antonio revealed a new element of his sadistic ritual to Theresa. As the fluorescent light overhead flickered, casting long, ominous shadows, he held up a hot iron brand. At the end was the symbol of the Camino de Santiago, the scallop shell. Theresa, Antonio began, his voice chillingly calm. The scallop shell is known to guide the souls of the dead along the Camino, to the end of the world and into the arms of God. If you let me mark you now, while you're still alive, your soul will surely make it to heaven. Theresa's eyes widened in terror at his words. Despite the weakness that had seeped into her bones from her cancer, she mustered every ounce of strength she had left to object. "No, you won't touch me with that thing. You won't." But the words fell on deaf ears. Antonio was stronger, and her frail body was no match for him. He held her down as she struggled against her restraints, her desperate cries echoing off the cold, stone walls of the basement. With the searing pain of the brand against her skin, she cried out, her voice bouncing off the walls of the dungeon. But Antonio was indifferent to her suffering. To him, this was a necessary part of his twisted ritual. Once the branding was done, he looked down at his handiwork, perverse satisfaction filling him. But as had become the norm, that satisfaction faded quickly, replaced by an insatiable craving that mirrored the emptiness within him. In the heartless dimness of the Mercedes house basement, Antonio began a macabre vigil, allowing Theresa to live for a few hours on the table while he taunted her about her suffering and impending death. It was a cruel dance he engaged in, hovering between the roles of tormentor and confidant. He took pleasure in playing God, deciding when her life would end. But Theresa, resilient even in her final hours, refused to let Antonio break her spirit. She clung onto the remnants of hope with a tenacity that astounded him. Her eyes held a spark that refused to be extinguished, a spark that seemed only to grow brighter with each passing moment. Even as her breaths grew shallow, her body racked. With pain and exhaustion, she stared back at him defiantly. Her eyes, bright with the untamed fire of her spirit, bore into Antonio's, a silent challenge in their depths. Antonio could see his own reflection in her eyes, a monstrous mirror image that filled him with a sickening mix of revulsion and fascination. He could almost feel her spirit beckoning him, challenging him to follow her through death's door. With a mix of reluctance and anticipation, Antonio slowly reached out, his hands finding their way around her frail neck. The skin beneath his fingers was cold, a reminder of the life that was slowly fading away. He kept his hands in place, applying pressure, feeling her pulse twitch erratically beneath his fingertips, like a trapped animal clawing for freedom. He watched as her eyes widened, her gaze locking onto his, the fiery spirit in her eyes gradually fading away like a dying flame. And then she was gone. Her body lay lifeless on the table, her spirit freed from its earthly bonds. But those eyes haunted him. The lifeless gaze, the extinguished fire were etched into his memory, a constant reminder of the monster he had become. It was those eyes, those haunting, lifeless eyes, that invaded Antonio's dreams, pulling him out of the cavernous depths of sleep. They followed him into the waking world, a ghostly apparition that hovered in his peripheral vision. The memory of them was burned into his retinas, popping up when he least expected. He would see them reflected in the polished surfaces around him, in the shadows that lingered around the Mercedes house, and in the cold gleam of his own eyes as he stared back at himself in the mirror. They were always there, watching him, accusing him, reminding him of his monstrosity. It was a relentless, unbearable haunting that sent chills up his spine and made his skin crawl. Snapping back to the present, Antonio found himself in the cold, cavernous basement of the Mercedes house, the familiar scene of his monstrous deeds. His heart pounded in his chest like a war drum, each beat amplifying the rhythm of his guilt. A shudder racked his body as he stood there, lost in the horrifying memories of his past. The relentless chill of the room seeped into his bones, the icy fingers of remorse and guilt wrapping around his heart. He was haunted, tormented by his own actions and the gazes of his victims. As the dark memory swirled around him, Antonio found himself fixated on his fourth victim, Isabella. Her face was so different from the other sprite, inquisitive and full of life. The circumstances leading up to her death were different too. Even in the dingy gloom of his bookstore, Isabella had shone. Antonio found himself charmed by her inquisitiveness. Her questions about the age-old shelves, the worn-out books, the stories hidden within the store's walls. In an uncharacteristic moment of weakness, he found himself offering her a glimpse into the secret room, a place he usually guarded fiercely. With a gleeful expression, she followed him into the dimly lit chamber that held his rarest texts. He saw her eyes widen with awe as she looked around, a child in a hidden candy store. They spent hours in there, him narrating tales of previous owners, sharing tidbits about the book collection, and watching her genuine interest with an odd sense of satisfaction. It was then that she revealed herself as a journalist, working on a feature about unique, off-the-beaten-path business in the city. As they conversed, she casually mentioned the Mercedes house in the Garden City. Antonio's demeanor shifted slightly. "Oh, why does that house interest you?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. She glanced around the store, then leaned in closer. "During my research, I stumbled upon some old local tales. Urban legends mostly about the Mercedes house. It said that it was once owned by the family of someone who ran this store. I thought it might add an intriguing historical angle to my feature." Antonio's mind raced. While it was true that the store's owner had family ties to the Mercedes house, Antonio was just an employee, and his personal ties to the house were a more guarded secret. "Ah, you must be referring to the owner's ancestors. It's been years since the family had any connection with that house." Antonio deflected, hoping to let her off track. However, Isabella, with her journalist's instincts, seemed to sense there was more to the story. "I believe there might be more recent TIs, perhaps through associates," she ventured, her eyes studying him for any sign of recognition. His heart pounded in his chest as he hastily dismissed the idea, telling her the owner wouldn't appreciate such exposure. But Isabella, headstrong and fearless, retorted that she would run the story regardless. This incensed Antonio, his hidden fury mounting beneath his controlled facade. Isabella departed from the store that day, leaving Antonio with a gnawing sense of unease. It had only taken her a few innocent inquiries to uncover more than he had ever willingly revealed to anyone before. In the 2 weeks following her first visit, Antonio was conned by a sense of unease. He felt as though he was walking on a razor's edge, a single misstep away from disaster. He would often find himself alone in the quiet store, surrounded by ancient tomes and dusty shelves, his heart pounding in anticipation. The silence seemed to echo with the promise of her return, leaving him restless and on edge. And return she did. Her face was alight with determination, her eyes sparkling with excitement. Antonio felt a stab of dread at her enthusiasm. He swallowed hard, his mouth dry, as he agreed to her request. They would go to the Mercedes house and meet with his boss. Isabella was elated, thrilled at the opportunity to further her story. His decision to appease her hung heavily over Antonio like a shroud. His pulse quickened as he watched Isabella, her excitement tangible, her impending doom unknown to her. He clenched his fists tightly, the corners of his mouth twisting into a tight smile. As Antonio led Isabella to the Mercedes house, he masked his intentions behind a veil of casual humor. He made light of the property's neglected state, gesturing at the wildly overgrown yard. "You see," he laughed, "I've been so busy at the shop, I haven't had time to play gardener for my boss." Isabella chuckled, her eyes taking in the unkempt surroundings. She picked her way through the dense foliage that swallowed the path to the front door. Antonio watched her, his heart pounding as he followed her through the garden gone wild. The joke, the charm, it was all a smokescreen meant to cover the ominous dread that was creeping up beneath the surface of Antonio's jovial demeanor. His darker impulses were awakening, ready to seize control once again. He laughed, but the laughter did not reach his eyes. Those remained cold, filled with a sinister anticipation. Just as Isabella opened her mouth to call out for Antonio's elusive boss, he struck. In a single swift move, he overpowered her, clamping a hand over her mouth and pulling her off balance. The suddenness of the attack stunned her into silence, and before she could recover, he delivered a swift blow to her head, knocking her out cold. He wasted no time, his practiced hands working efficiently to drag her limp body downstairs into the basement. The concrete floor was cold and harsh against her skin as he secured her to the table, each clink of the chains reverberating ominously throughout the room. When Isabella awoke, her scream, raw and filled with terror, echoed off the walls of the basement. The red-hot brand seared her flesh, the smell of burning skin mingling with her panicked cries. Antonio stood over her, an unhinged smile playing on his lips, his eyes gleaming with a perverse delight. He reveled in the sound of her agony, the sight of her squirming against her restraints. It was a sickening ecstasy, more powerful and addictive than anything H experienced before. "Please, Antonio, don't do this." "You don't have to do this," Isabella cried, her voice echoing against the stone walls. Her eyes were wide with terror, the light from the solitary bulb overhead glinting off her tears. Antonio, however, simply looked down at her, a twisted smile playing at the corners of his lips. "Donna Isabella?" he asked, his tone mocking. "See, you don't understand. I need to do this, and it's all thanks to you." Isabella was shaking her head, tears streaming down her face. "I never meant for any of this. Please, Antonia." Ignoring her pleas, Antonio simply continued. "You brought this on yourself, Isabella," he told her. "You were too nosy for your own good." The room filled with Isabella's terrified sobs, the sounds growing louder as Antonio reveled in his control over her. "I didn't start off as a monster, you know," Antonio said, his voice strangely calm amid the grim surroundings. "I was just a guy who started working at a bookstore. I was different, unremarkable." His gaze fell on Isabella, her terrified eyes meeting his. But then the power it was too intoxicating. "The owner of the shop was my first victim in this city. He vanished and no one ever questioned it. I took over the shop and no one ever suspected." A chilling laugh escaped him as he paced the room, continuing his dark tale. "Then came Rosa, Maria, Theresa falling into my trap one by one. And now you, Isabella, you're part of my story now." Isabella was shaking her head, her sobs growing louder. Please, Antonia don't want to be a part of Theresa, didn't want any of this. But Antonio only smiled wider at her pleas. "It's too late for that, Isabella. Too late," he told her, his voice dropping to a chilling whisper. This is your story now." Isabella's pleas reverberated off the stone walls, growing softer as the horror of her situation set in. Despite her terror, she held on to hope, her voice trembling as she begged Antonio for mercy. But mercy was a virtue that had long since abandoned Antonio. He held the knife, his grip steady and unyielding. He traced the blade over the fresh brand on her skin, a symbol of his control over her. Each whimper she let out was music to his ears, fueling his perverse pleasure. His heart pounded with a sick thrill as he held her life in his hands. With a cruel, satisfied smile, he plunged the knife into her heart. The scream that she had been holding back echoed through the room, then faded into a strangled gasp. The light faded from her eyes, replaced by the emptiness of death. Her pleas for mercy were silenced forever. Antonio had stepped back, a macabre sense of satisfaction welling up inside him. The sight of her lifeless body, the eerie silence that had replaced her begging, had been a reminder of his power and control. He had felt invincible. But now, as Antonio's bare back lay on the cold steel, all he could think of was the chilling silence that enveloped him. His mind kept replaying their final moments, the desperate pleas and resigned acceptance. His heart pounded in sync with their fading heartbeats, a symphony of his past actions. A shadow loomed over him, neither real nor entirely imagined. From the recesses of his memory, the spectre of the man aged, killed as a child, materialized, its gaze heavy and unyielding. As a boy, Antonio had been both repulsed and fascinated by the man's mysterious, malevolent aura. In death, the man had never truly left him. Instead, he lingered, watching over Antonio, guiding him, almost as a mentor would a prot. This spectral guardian had whispered dark secrets into Antonio's ear, teaching him to embrace the monster within. Every act of cruelty, every descent into madness, had been under the watchful eye of this ghostly presence. The weight of realization bore down on Antonio, his life of horror might have been, in part, orchestrated by this phantom from his past. However, the torment of his deeds did not keep sleep at bay for long. Exhaustion slowly crept over him, dragging him into its cold embrace. The basement fell into a deeper silence as Antonio's restless thoughts gave way to the darkness, and he finally succumbed to a dreamless sleep. The night stretched on, oblivious to the monster resting in its depths. Tomorrow was another day, and who knew what horrors it might bring.